Hello, I'm Jeff Wilson. Welcome to Exploration of Local History. This is actually not local history, it's more family history for me. But let's start with it anyway. The murder of Richard Walter Fitch. The crisp winter morning of Thursday, January 7th, 1932. Walter Fitch Farm, south of Dunkirk, Saskatchewan. Richard Walter Fitch, known as Walter, family consists of Mrs. Della Marie Fitch, wife, James Richard Fitch, son, age 9, and Charles William Fitch, infant son, almost 18 months. The murder. At 7 a.m., hired man Peter Eli Janot, who has been helping several farmers, including Walter's brother Arthur, has been working for Walter Fitch since October of 1931 and leaves the house to do chores at the barn. About a half hour hence, Walter rises, lights the home fires, gathers up his lantern and his milk pail, making his way to the barn. As Fitch approaches the barn, a gunshot rings out, and he is struck by a bullet that goes through his left breast and through his heart, ending up hanging on a piece of flesh near his left armpit, according to the coroner. Death comes almost instantaneously. Janot approaches the farmhouse with a rifle in his hand. Mrs. Della Fitch is alleged not to have heard a shot. She stepped out onto the veranda. One account says it was to look at a thermometer. Still approaching, Janot says, "I've killed your husband. He made me too mad." Mrs. Fitch, in shock, instructs him not to enter the house. Janot responds she needn't worry, he wouldn't kill her. Conflicting news reports. One account has Janot turning from the house at this point and leaving the property on foot, and then Mrs. Fitch running to find her husband's body outside the barn. Another account has her running to the body, apparently accepting Janot's promise not to kill her. Then Janot enters the home alone with the two children, taking more ammunition before vacating the scene on foot. Yet another account tells of brother Arthur testifying about having given Janot several rounds of rifle shells in October of the previous year that would fit the murder weapon, which was owned by his late brother. Janot is last seen by Mrs. Fitch walking towards the highway. When Janot has left, Mrs. Fitch allegedly sends her 9-year-old son, James Richard, to run to his Uncle Arthur's neighboring farm to telephone or wire the RCMP. The victim. Richard Walter Fitch was born in Bethany of the Peterborough, Ontario district, a schoolteacher with a University of Toronto degree. Noted as a well-liked and fair gentleman farmer. Mrs. Della Marie Fitch hails from a farm in the township of Artemisia, Grey County, Ontario. Mrs. Richard Fitch, mother of both Arthur and Walter, is widowed and living in the same area as they at the time. The accused. Peter Eli Janot, last name has French origins, is a married immigrant from Czechoslovakia and or Yugoslavia. Newspaper accounts and records mention both, who was hiring out his services to several local farmers, including the Fitch brothers. In the January 8, 1932 Regina Leader Post, Mrs. W. J. Sisson, a cousin by marriage to the deceased, describes Janot as a hard-working, cleanly, and untiring worker who could never commit such an act in a sane moment. She liked Peter and found no fault with him. One quote attributed to her is alternately insightful and alarming, in quotes. The fact that he was not self-supporting because of the present times might have caused him to do this terrible thing to Walter. The chase. Informed of his brother's murder by 9-year-old nephew, James Richard, Arthur Fitch gets a message to the coroner and RCMP at Mossbank. Then, leaving Richard at his farm in safety, embarks to Walter's farm where Della is waiting. Raw in the memory of Arthur and wife Elsie is the tragedy of losing their home to fire the previous year and having to rebuild. Constable McNally of the Mounties arrives and quickly begins to pick up the trail. Arthur and coroner Dr. Welch appear to join in. but newspaper accounts conflict about whether they continue or drop out. Janot leads them on an invasive manhunt. At one point, the posse tallies 21 men. Janot approaches the farm of A. Ferrara, whom he knows. He is hungry and eating Ferrara's food at one point, but forced to leave when, from a window, he sees officers closing in. Gunfire is exchanged at the W. Scott farm. Janot is holed up in some bush country on W. Scott's farm, which is used as the base for the RCMP and the posse. On Highway Number 2, near the correction line, 12 miles south of Moose Jaw, the RCMP throws up its first cordon around Janot. Somehow he slips through, seeing their flashlights, but evading notice. Janot sneakily advances and doubles back repeatedly, baffling his pursuers, until reaching the town of Tilney. The posse alternately loses, then rediscovers the trail, eventually leading them to Moose Jaw. The group spreads out as they approach Moose Jaw in a vain attempt to find the fugitive. One of the cars in pursuit of Janot drives along River Street West, a notorious area during Prohibition era, and views Janot, unarmed and leaning casually in front of the American Hotel. After a 26-hour manhunt, he is approached and, offering no resistance, arrested and taken into custody at 8:15 a.m. Friday, January 8, 1932. In a rare occurrence, 2 alleged murderers are held that weekend in the same Cornwall Street depot of Regina Jail, Janot occupying a cell near alleged murderer Mike Spone, who was charged with the murder of Malcolm MacDonald, age 19, in the Barvis district near Yorkton on December 18, 1931. The irony. In this era, Moose Jaw's River Street West has a reputation of being on top of tunnels built for gun running, rum running, and also Asian immigrant laborers escaping the dangerous work of building the railroad. Gangsters such as the notorious Al Capone supposedly used the sophisticated tunnel system to evade people, such as Elliot Ness and the U.S. Treasury authorities. It is possible that if Janot had just connected with the right person, he could have vanished without a trace, and his story might have had an entirely different ending. Why did Janot give up without a fight? Perhaps he wanted to be caught. Or maybe he didn't know he was so close to escaping into a tunnel and disappearing. The most likely possibility is that since he had just successfully escaped the police at Tilney, he just thought he was in the clear and was just chilling out. The trial. Dr. W.T.O. Welch in Expanse, Saskatchewan, opens the inquest into Fitch's death on January 15, 1932, followed right away by Janot's preliminary trial. The jury comes to a quick verdict. Richard Walter Fitch was killed by a .25-20 rifle fired by Peter Eli Janot. Mrs. Fitch and Sons had by now returned to live with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. James L. Irving, in the township of Artemisia, Grey County, Ontario. Mrs. Della Fitch and her 2 sons travel back west for the trial. Both she and Richard will give testimony. Eventually, Janot himself gives testimony, revealing he had been brooding about money from a provincial labor relief plan that he believed Fitch had been receiving and keeping his share of. In truth, only one day before being murdered, Fitch received the application for the relief plan, which had yet to be filled out and sent back. Janot also testified that he and Fitch argued about Janot once having been served a chicken alleged by the latter to be diseased and unfit to eat. After assessment, Janot was declared fit to stand trial on March 15, 1932, although Dr. A. Campbell declared he could converse normally, but was distinctly delusional, suffering hallucinations and a persecution complex. While not readily apparent, he suggested a state of insanity could be in an early stage. C.H.J. Burroughs entered an insanity plea on behalf of Janot, but he was found guilty anyway, sentenced to hang on June 17, 1932. Burroughs appealed the verdict on May 9, 1932, and was granted a new trial. Janot, thinking his execution date was actually the release date, became incensed with the defense team for appealing, thinking he could have been out laboring in the fields and earning money. Janot's new trial was scheduled for October 25, 1932, But on October 27th, 1932, the jury found him unfit to stand trial, after testimony by Drs. Campbell and O.E. Rothwell indicating he was suffering hallucinations and persecutory delusions. In conclusion, no public information exists on what became of Janot, but one could surmise he spent the rest of his life in some form of institution. Arthur and Elsie Fitch tried farming here for 2 more years, eventually moving to Belcaris in 1934, just northeast of Regina. The land was purchased by Frank Wormlinger, who sold to Lorne Carlson in the 1980s. Walter's widow, Della Marie Fitch, moved back to her native Grey County and remarried, giving birth to 2 more sons, widowed a second time, and a third marriage ended in separation. In May 1998, Della reached age 100 before dying in her 101st year in Chatsworth, Ontario. The 9-year-old boy who conveyed the news of his father's murder to his Uncle Arthur, James Richard Fitch, joined the 103rd RCAF Squadron during World War II and was killed in action July 26, 1943. He is buried in Reichswald Forest War Cemetery in Cleve, Germany. The infant boy who didn't learn of these tragic events until well after the fact, Charles William Fitch, was a longtime Rockland, Ontario resident and well-known personality in nearby Owen Sound for managing the award-winning Food City store until his retirement. He died in 2018, reaching his 89th year, buried in Markdale Cemetery, Markdale, Ontario. In the years since, owner Lorne Carlson found the south part of the property, while reclaimed somewhat by nature, still dubiously attracting passing highway visitors. Their Facebook page history alleges the remnants of Arthur and Elsie's former house was still nearby for a time. In 1996, Carlson had an outhouse rest stop constructed there that eventually became the Carlson Crapper. In 2024, the site boasts a social media presence and a loyal following. It was the 2018 subject of a CBC TV news piece which alleges it was the most famous outhouse in Saskatchewan. The Carlson Crapper, an unexpected yet light-hearted sign-off for my research into the murder of Richard Walter Fitch. So thanks again. It's Jeff Wilson here. Thanking you for joining me for Adventures in Local History. See you next time. Hi, it's Jeff Wilson back. Do you consider what I do important to you? If you do, would you consider supporting me on Patreon? Check out the link below.